All right, and we are recording live. So, welcome everyone, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Karlee Fellner back for episode 11, which is also part 2 of episode 10. So, it's a bit of a mouthful for everyone. Probably going to be a bit of confusion when reading the title, but episode 11 is episode 11. It is a new episode, but it is also a continuation of episode 10. So part 2 of episode 10. So as far back as I can remember, because it's been a whole week since we last did episode 10, part 1 of our conversation. Now we are carrying on from that conversation. We described who Dr. Karlee was as a person. We also described the similarities and the parallels between both our stories as entrepreneurs, as women, as Indigenous women, and what we've seen and what we've come to know and address within our lives of Indigenous and colonial-based societies. So prior to the recording of this episode, I had briefly asked Dr. Karlee Fellner, Karlee, if we had discussed directly question 2. Now, if question 1, just to jog everyone's memory as well as our memories for ourselves, question 1 asked Dr. Karlee Fellner to describe herself in her own words, which we had addressed that, and a little bit we indirectly answered question 2, which question 2, how did your path lead you to becoming a podcast host and a psychologist? And what aspect of your work do you find the most fulfilling?
Awesome. So good to be back. Thank you, Stella.
Of course.
It has been a full week since, hasn't it?
Yes, it has.
So yeah, we'll just get right into it. And if you don't know who I am, listen to the previous episode. I always love answering this question. It's a little bit funny because I grew up in the time before, when the internet was like just being developed, right? Like we didn't have internet in our home. I'm older than I might look. And so, growing up in small town Alberta, as I shared last time, I grew up in Devon, just southwest of Edmonton, not far from the city, but still, I didn't actually know that psychologists existed, to be honest with you. We didn't have a psychologist in Devon, but I mean that I know of back then. So I never had any sort of aspirations to be a psychologist. I remember growing up and having this like, oh, I want to be a writer. I want to be an artist. I want to be an actress. I want to be an astronaut, all these different things, most of which are part of my portfolio today, except for astronaut. I haven't quite got there, and I don't think I will in this lifetime. But it was so funny because coming out of high school, I was the first person in my nuclear family and extended family to attend post-secondary school. And so I didn't really know what I was doing. I honestly just went to the University of Alberta because I had an entrance scholarship and I didn't know what else to do when I graduated. And so, I went into university doing a general Bachelor of Arts degree, having literally no clue what I was going to be studying. And I remember at some point in my first year, a couple of my friends were like, oh, if you want a really easy A, you should take psychology. And I was like, psychology, hey, what is this? And so I literally took my first psychology course in the second year of my undergrad because I was told it would be an easy A. So then I'm in the course and I'm, learning the material and I'm like, oh, this is actually interesting. Like we are, kind of studying people. I mean, the word psychology, believe it or not, actually means the study of the soul, which ties back to my podcast. I can speak to that after. But And psychiatry is actually the healing of the soul, right? At the time, I didn't know that. And, I can definitely say that contemporary dominating psychology certainly has strayed far away from those roots, right? It's
Yes.
very often not acknowledging the soul, or actually explicitly dismissing it or categorizing it in some sort of deficit or pathology. Either way, at the time, I really was fascinated starting to learn that. When I was growing up, I experienced a lot of bullying in grade school. And so I always had this fascination with human nature and, like, why do people do the things they do? And, why is this like this? And stuff like that. And so I really kind of got sucked into it. And at the time, I always say that the Euro-Western mainstream education system did a pretty good job of indoctrinating me into colonial thinking. So I was at a time in my life where, if people asked me, are you religious? Are you spiritual? Whatever, people used to have those conversations back then in a different way, I guess. I would say no, like, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in spirits. I don't believe in ghosts. I don't, I'm not religious at all of that stuff. And I was very much about science. Like, I had been kind of trained to think in science. And that happened, in elementary school and onward, because I remember when I was a very young child being very connected to spirit and to the land and all of that. But then just over time having that indoctrinated out of me through the education system. And so when I went into my undergrad, I was very much in that, like, oh, this is so interesting to study kind of thing. The one thing I did always acknowledge, which I think is important to say because it ties in to the question and everything else we've talked about, is that while I would say, like, nah, I'm an atheist, and I don't believe in this and that, I always would say, but I do feel something when I'm in the Rocky Mountains that I can't explain. There was this sort of, but there's a something when I'm in this place that I can't explain through, Euro-Western scientific paradigms of observation and measurement. And so, yeah, it's interesting because I first was drawn into the field because of my draw to the science of psychology, and fascination, this is so ironic, with psychopathology, with diagnosis, with the DSM. And so I ended up taking the U of A's cooperative work experience program, which is where, you do an undergrad in psychology and you tack on a whole extra year of working full time at an internship where you're working in the field. And so I was at a place called Rosehaven Care Center, which is a geriatric psychiatric facility in Camrose, which is where I was born. And so I moved to Camrose for a year and worked at Rosehaven. And being there, my job, for the most part, most of my time was meant to be spending time with the residents, or I guess patients is what they would be called. But, just to hang out with them essentially and be company to them. And even at that time, even when I was in this colonial paradigm of, like, oh yeah, so-and-so has a diagnosis of schizophrenia and so had a traumatic brain injury. And, even then, I remember just having this, like, these people who are here have an intelligence that I don't understand. Like, I had a sense that there was some giftedness that I didn't understand, but I didn't know how to explain it because I was coming from, again, this very mainstream psychology thing. So, that was there. And I still felt very drawn to, like, I want to work with people. I want to support people because I don't know, this is interesting, right? I just really felt drawn in. So then I go into my master's degree and I ended up doing counseling psychology at the University of Alberta. Initially, I wanted to do clinical because I was so interested in psychopathology and diagnosis. Again, this is so ironic and hilarious, especially for people who listen to my podcast. It's like, what? Because I'm debunking all this stuff. But it's like, you know, you gotta learn it. You learn it to critique it too, right? So I'm so glad I got into counseling, because I did want to do clinical, but at the time I hadn't written some of the entrance exams required. So I was like, man, I'll just throw in an application for counseling psych. If I get in, I get in. If I don't, I'll try for clinical next year. Sure enough, got in, studied counseling. And the pivotal moment for me was during my master's degree. A friend of mine and I partnered up in what was called, and I say that because I don't like this terminology, what was called multicultural counseling. And so we were, yeah, that's a whole other podcast episode. But we partnered up, and our job was to explore, you know, what are some of the things that psychologists should consider when working with Indigenous people and communities. You know, I mean, at that time in my life, like, I knew I was Métis. I knew I had this heritage, but because I wasn't brought up explicitly with the culture and ceremonies and those practices, and that being a central part of my identity, it was something that just at that time was sort of by the wayside. It's like I knew it was there, but you know, I'm really just here to learn about how therapists should best work with Indigenous people. You know, it was very much just coming from that learning place. And through that project and starting to talk to folks, we connected with a lot of groups there on campus, and then attended an elders conference in Edmonton. That's when it was like, oh, what we were learning, which in hindsight now is like, duh, is that psychologists, therapists, counselors, social workers were honestly really mucking it up with Indigenous communities, right? There was tremendous harm being done. By and large, people were telling us, like, we don't trust therapists to go see them. Like, it ain't happening. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, I want someone to support me with my trauma, but I actually experience re-traumatization when I go. And that was it. That was the pivotal moment for me. That was like, oh, this just turned into something different. Oh, this is why I'm here. And so, you know, I took a year off after my master's intentionally. I wasn't super keen on university, but then it was just like, I gotta go back. So I ended up getting into the PhD program at UBC on Coast Salish territories out in Vancouver. And I went in with the intention of learning, how do psychologists need to work differently with Indigenous peoples? Because from everything I'm hearing, our profession's causing all kinds of harm. So this was 2010. And I went in to look at that, and it ended up being this, you know, journey of no return, which I would never want to return anyway, so we're all good in that. But I remember even having this moment of like, I'm about to kind of leap off this cliff that I can't turn back from, because moving into the work of understanding how can mental health services better serve Indigenous peoples, which ended up being the topic of my dissertation research, I had to dive into who I was as a Métis woman, as an Indigenous woman, someone whose family had been displaced through the half-breed script process, and whose family had to put away our language, our ceremonies, and our practices in order to survive through the attempted genocide, right? And so I really had to go in deep, which I know I talked about little pieces of that last time, but basically I dove in head first. You know, I was attending ceremony all the time, any chance I could, basically, and ended up, you know, connecting with a couple of mentors who, you know, I continue to learn with and from out there, and helping them in ceremony. And it was a really rapid, like I say, kind of head first process for myself of beginning to live and breathe Indigenous approaches to wellness, of learning that, like, oh, what I had learned as far as using, drinking to feel better, to relax as my medicine. Oh, that's actually not healthy, and kind of coming to realize, wait a minute, like I've been missing all my medicines, not my medicines, but our medicines, my family medicines, community medicines, and that's why I've been turning to these other ways. I always laugh when people from pre 2010 in my life kind of connect with me now. They knew me as a partier, right? So, and now it's like, oh, I haven't even had a sip of alcohol in over 10 years, which is something I couldn't have imagined, before that time. And so my life completely changed because I went headfirst into that journey of connecting with who I truly was, even receiving my name, right? Knowing who I am per my name, good-hearted woman, and what that means about me. And it's like, whoa, it just opens up that understanding of my gifts, my purpose, what I'm here to do, as well as some of the challenges I'm going to face and the things that are going to try to buck me off. And so, it was going into that at the same time as going into my research and having these conversations with knowledge holders on how mental health services need to change to best serve our people. And it was just like, that became my life from 2010 until present moment and until the day I die. That is my life. I live and breathe to the best of my ability, miope matiswin, living a good life according to our teachings and ways. And am I perfect? Absolutely not. No human being is. There's a lot of aspects of my own health that are out of balance right now for various reasons that are inextricably connected to capitalism and colonialism as well. And the ways that we raise our families alone without the support of community. I mean, we could really get into all of that too, but I do my best, to live those values, which I was raised with. I spoke about that last episode, and to really implement, to the best of my ability, these ways of living. And so I took that with me into academia for the time I was there. I never had any intention of being a professor. I did not. The only reason that I did become a professor was literally, it was two incidents happening at the same time, well, three, I guess, of me having a dream that essentially told me I needed to apply for this position. Having an elder who doesn't tell anybody what to do tell me I needed to apply for that position. And having the dean of education at the time from the University of Calgary there on campus at UBC at a time that I just so happened to run into someone that told me I needed to go there, right? So I never wanted to be an academic at any time, to be fully honest. But then all of these things guided me to do it. And what I know is to trust the guidance of spirit, follow that path, to know I don't know why I'm being pulled into here, but I'm going to follow it and I'll do my best. And that being said, I knew I had a passion to support Indigenous students and to the best of my ability, make an imprint within the academy and scholarship as far as authentic Indigenous research, like actual Indigenous research approaches, which are rooted in Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, supporting students in that so that they could fully be themselves, their Indigenous selves, mind, body, heart, and spirit in their totality within the academy without having academics who were oppressing or limiting them, but actually creating that space to open, to be exactly who they are, to do their work, follow their spirit, to have, basically this haven within that space. And obviously, a big part of my MO while I was in there was doing whatever I could to support us having more Indigenous psychologists in the world, because there's still incredible barriers to Indigenous students getting into counseling psych programs or clinical psych programs. And then, those that make it in past all of those barriers that are set up, often are made to conform in those spaces, right? And so I was really passionate about creating space where they could, like I say, fully be their Indigenous selves and do their work in the way that they and community need them to do the work. And so I am grateful for the time that I spent there. I was on faculty from 2013 to 2023. I was there just shy of 10 and a half years, just 10 years and 5 months to be exact. I was there, and in that time we did some incredible work getting land-based programs in Indigenous approaches to wellness going with the local communities, where students got to learn on the land with elders in ceremony, on reserve, at a graduate level of education, and where we removed barriers to admission, where we were able to have write letters of support for students to get in who didn't have the qualifying GPAs, who didn't have some of the degree requirements to get in. And yet once they're in those programs, they just excelled because the programs were done as much as possible from Indigenous approaches to knowing, being, and doing, right? And so I was doing that work throughout that time as much as I possibly could, and continuing doing research and work in community-driven approaches to wellness. The thing is, Inuak Indigenous peoples have thousands upon thousands of years of Indigenous evidence-based practice in wellness, in dealing with trauma and grief. We have all the medicine, all the knowledge we need to heal ourselves, our families, and our communities. And people know, Indigenous people know what's needed. So none of this was new knowledge, going out there, doing this research. It's like, I remember doing my dissertation and some of the knowledge holders just saying, we've been saying this for decades. It's kind of getting exhausting, but I guess I'll say it again, right? And it's like, yeah, like people have been asking for these changes, and the action piece doesn't happen, right? And so that was my whole motivation was, let's get this stuff in writing so that we can use it to speak to funders and say, hey, check this out. We have our own processes of evidence-based practice that go back thousands of years. And this is what communities need. And we need to come out of these colonial approaches and paradigms of thinking. And so in that time, I ended up being involved in a lot of national and international, particularly in the States, movements for the profession of psychology to be apologizing to our people. I, to this day, remain very disappointed at how few psychologists actually know that in 2018, our very own professional body, the Canadian Psychological Association, along with the Psychology Foundation of Canada, commissioned a working group, or a task force in military language, that was used to write a report on how the profession of psychology needs to respond to the TRC. So that came out in May 2018. If you're listening to this and you're a psychologist, you have no excuse not to Google it now. Look it up. But that document issues an apology on behalf of the profession of psychology to Indigenous peoples in Canada. And it gives very concrete steps that psychologists, psychological researchers, educators, professors, people who do assessments, therapy, that they can take to minimize the harm that's been happening and perpetuated in our field, and to move toward practice that's going to be actually beneficial to Indigenous peoples and communities. Because like I say, our people are at the forefront of healing. They are the people that are raring and ready to go for doing the deep trauma work, healing themselves, families, communities, healing these intergenerational cycles that traveled across the ocean to Turtle Island and were instated here. We are the leaders in that healing. And so we do need our clinicians of all kinds, and of course our frontline community service providers to step forward and do that work in the best way possible, in ways that are rooted in our knowledges, our wisdoms, and our approaches. And so, that drives my passion for the work. The American Psychological Association also issued an apology to Native American and Alaska Natives on behalf of the profession for all of the harm that's occurred. Apologies are great. They mean nothing if there's no follow through, right? So at that point, if there's no follow through, it's just something that's making the oppressor feel better, right? So it's like, we got to pick up that work and take it forward. And that's really where my passion in my work as a psychologist comes from. And then, another kind of game changer moment was 2013 when I took training in Indigenous focusing oriented therapy, which to my knowledge, as someone who's been swimming in this field for a long time, is the only fully Indigenous approach to psychotherapy that has been articulated, right? We do have, psychologists out there working in these ways just naturally, but it's not articulated in any other place. And so it's a full approach to therapy that's rooted in Indigenous cosmologies and conceptualizations and interventions, using somatic tools as the starting point to accessing the intergenerational and collective conversations that are coming through people's bodies. And so all of this is like my path as a psychologist, and I would consider myself, if we look at that term psychologist, a person who studies the soul. I'd say, yeah, that's what I've been doing, right? And that is exactly why I started the podcast, was to remind everybody, about the study of the soul. Soul medicine, ancient psychologies for wellness, is that reminder that these ancient psychologies have been around for thousands upon thousands of years, that Inuak Indigenous peoples globally from every part of this earth have thousands and thousands of years of very complex, deep understanding of what it means to be human, of like philosophies of being and wellness. And it's actually incredibly advanced, right? So it's funny because it comes back to this, what in IFOT we talk about as the and, that on one hand, I have this like, oh, I don't like to admit I'm a psychologist because the field has done so much damage and harm and continues to. I hear it every single day in people that come to me for sessions. And the and of it is like, yeah, let me reclaim that term as someone who studies the soul and works with the soul, because that's what we actually do as Inuak Indigenous people, right? And so I started the Soul Medicine podcast. It had been on the shelf, waiting in the wings for years. I actually wanted to start it up a few years ago, and there's a few reasons that I didn't do it at the time. But I finally came to the point where, I was witnessing on social media in particular, what seems to me to be a huge uptick in people self-diagnosing, self-pathologizing, really buying into the system of pathology and the colonial deficit narrative, which means often taking on these labels as conditions that are limiting, right? That people actually believe they don't have the power that they truly do have. because they're being told these deficit narratives about themselves and have taken that on. And so the fire under my butt to finally get the podcast going was seeing this and saying, you know what? I mean, it's a monster. It's a force that I know I can't take down because people are so invested in that system of pathology and the wellness industry and medication and all the, you know, all these industries that are entangled. However, what I can do is at least get this information out there. At least it's available. You know, if just a couple people hear it and they say, oh, wow, like I'm not fucked up, then I've done my job, right? That is my passion, is having people remember who they are and know that every one of us are perfectly whole, well human beings behind whatever's going on up here, the trauma, the grief, you know, all the things that we go through. And to remember that they, you know, we are powerful beyond measure, that we have the power to heal ourselves, our families, our communities, and that we don't have limitations in that. You know what I mean? So anyway, that's my long answer to your question.
Well, I just wanted to thank you in advance for putting me on the spot to being patient. And you've mentioned that you've you know, you love to speak, you're a storyteller by nature. At the same time, it can play hand in hand with us going back to pre-colonial times, where I am sure that it must have been amongst our teachings, it must have been amongst our values, patience, along with respect and along with love, with community. There must have been, you know, somewhere within our teachings and how it was passed generationally to be patient. That's something I have a hard time with, is patience, and I know that's a flaw of mine. I know that takes working on and getting used to, and sort of coding myself with, just to sit there and let the person speak, let the person talk, because there's been a lot of things, not just allowing a person space to breathe and to talk and to go over what needs to be said. You know, there's a lot of important information that you given in your long answer of question 2. And also you've indirectly and schematically, your answer draws parallel to answering question 5, which question 5 asks about the meaning of reconciliation and the steps that we can take, and where and how do we begin towards reconciliation. You've already discussed and described your part of reconciliation, which is, you know, breaking down the barriers and breaking down the myths, and, you know, being a support person, being that person that can bridge the gap between colonialism and pre-colonial Indigenous practices and knowledge, by sharing stories, and, you know, debunking those myths, debunking falsified facts or falsified truths is. And you're also taking part in reconciliation is, as you've mentioned, being a part of a body, of a system, of an organization that attributes a form of an apology, a form of creating a bridging a gap, especially for our people. Because I've heard it several times as well, of how they don't want to go to the doctors. It plays hand in hand why they wouldn't want to go to a therapy session, or they wouldn't want to speak to a therapist or a counselor or a mental health therapist or a registered registered psychiatrist is because that can play hand in hand with going to the hospital, going to the clinic, going to the doctors. Whenever they have something that you know and you feel that that's dangerous. For example, my mama, not too long ago, over a month and a half ago, she was visiting out on the reserve from where her family's from, Little Pine in Saskatchewan, southern Saskatchewan. And she was visiting family. She was at our family house, where my grandparents resided for a time during the prime of their life, and lived out many of their later years. While she was visiting, my mom had an accident where she was going down the stairs, because it's a split level. So you go up the stairs and then there's a split level top floor. That's the living room, the kitchen, the bedrooms, and then the foyer, or rather the mud area. You go down to your left, there's another set of stairs which lead you down to the basement. And I can't recall or remember if she stated which set of stairs she was at, but she was coming down the stairs, and she slipped and fell, and she hit her coccyx, her tailbone, which immediately after I heard that, I immediately moved back home. And that's a delicate dance for myself as a human being and as a residential school survivor's daughter, but also as a daughter in everyday life. Is, when you hear something happen to your parents, you're immediately, in some way, shape, or form, you're shell-shocked. It's sort of your body going, oh my God, something happened to my mom. She had an accident. I need to immediately move back home. And you forget all of your past fights, your past disagreements, and the past, of what you couldn't stand with the person and why you moved out of home in the first place. Being a human being is tough. And that goes hand in hand with having discussions. That goes hand in hand with learning patience and having learned patience. And not just for allowing someone to speak and, passing them the talking stick and saying, here you go. It's your time to talk. You have the talking stick. Metaphorically, we don't have physical talking stick with us. But metaphorically, you had at the beginning, during giving your answer for question 2, you had the talking stick. So now it's passed on to me. And that must have been a way for people pre-colonial times, the talking stick. I have a belief and a theory that wholeheartedly that was a way for people to respond and react accordingly to learned patience. And sorry, I don't know if you heard that background audio. That was someone phoning me, but because my phone and my laptop, they're Bluetooth connected, so I was just wondering if anybody heard that background noise. That was just my phone in the background. Anyways, going to my theory of the talking stick, it must have been a way of participating in the reactionary and the responsive time, but also the tools to work with learned patients. Someone has a talking stick, they may be taking longer to answering the question or the objective of a topic, is because we have to work with ourselves, work with the patients, and they must have been very good advocates for that patient, for allowing someone to share their story and to carry out their story, because that's knowledge. Again, as I mentioned in part 1 of previous episode 10, is that the children were at the center, and then it was the grandparents, and then the universities and colleges, our PhD holders, our knowledge keepers and knowledge holders, and then it was the parents on the outside. Being that the cookums and the mushums, the grandmothers and grandfathers, were on the outer ring outside of the children, it speaks volumes, because there was no indoctrination of going to school or going to college or holding a higher placeholder of an education. That was already centralized and centered to the core values of love, respect, patience, community, empathy. I don't remember all of what each pole represents for the 13 teepees, so I'm just going off of what I strongly feel were strongly and primarily represented within our Indigenous communities. So going back to when I heard that my mom had the incident and I immediately moved back home, all of that sort of washed away of our past disagreements and our past, nitpicking and headbutting. And I went into the mode of being the daughter who is the caretaker, who is the advocate, who is the representative of goodness between a primal caregiver and the child, the one who needs to be brought up. And to me, being a human being, it has its ups and downs. And being a woman, especially an Indigenous woman, it has its ups and downs. It has its beauties, as well as its opposites of beautifulness. For example, being a woman, you're dealing with the societal indifferences between man and woman, and how it feels very much predatory as the years and the decades go on. It enlarges itself, the dangers of being a woman. Don't go walking out at night. Walk with a buddy. If you're going out alone, make sure you have a safe person you can share your location with, and that person is responsible and can take action immediately should something arise or something happen. And in a way, it's like this metaphorical dark cloud hanging over us. Don't go out at night. Don't talk with strange men. Don't talk to strangers, period. Don't pick up hitchhikers. Don't go out alone, especially during the daytime. Have a buddy system. Have that person you share your live location with. God forbid, if something happens, if something did happen, something bad happened, make sure that you scratch his face or you scratch his skin so you have his DNA on your hands, so that if it tragically and horrifically led to you joining the ancestors in the afterlife, you've at least given clues to who the person was. And it's tough being a woman. You have to just sit back and just take a deep breath and remind yourself that this life is worth living, but it also comes with its challenges. There's challenges to be faced for everything. And going back to how our people, we're not very open people. We're not an open book. And past traumas, and also, re-traumatizing. If they don't have the tools, they're either out of ignorance or just out of stupidity, or just simply that, they were blinded by colonialism, that they did not identify the tools of communicating the way that we were taught pre-colonial times to communicate, is to listen with your heart and your soul and your mind. Let this do the listening and the talking. And so if we can't have those communications, especially within colonized occupations such as a mental health therapist or registered nurse or a doctor or a surgeon or a registered psychologist or psychiatrist, counselor, therapist, if they cannot be the people who bridge the gap and who are, the placeholders for those open-ended conversations, for us to talk about our traumas and to talk about how it is astronomically different, completely polar opposite of how we were raised and brought up, before the times that we became a constitutional body, we became a country, we became Canada and the United States, and how we were divided in different laws within each state, each province, and all of this, Indian affairs and the northern affairs of the First Nations. Before all of that, we were simply one with the land, and we were one people within Turtle Island. There was no separation, of gender, of race, of sort of indifference between categories. We were very much people. And, if you go back further into the history, there was intertribal trading, intertribal collectiveness and sharedness, and there was no such thing as we discussed, as I mentioned in previous episode, is, there was no such thing as homelessness. Someone's home was destroyed for whatever reason, whether that be a natural disasters like flood, rain, or fire. The community, the rest of the tribe members, they come together after a collective agreement. They would rebuild the family's, home. And no one went without food. Everyone was taken care of. Everyone had their jobs and their roles, and everybody, there was no such thing as it is now, reconciliation. But the steps that we need to take towards reconciliation is take that breath. Once you've had that breath, go, okay, now what is it that needs to be fixed? And how does it need to be fixed so that it is not further re-traumatizing or redoing the mistakes of the past, that we are not reattributing and reattributing to those mistakes, but we are rather bridging or webbing or branching away, and we are making those connections and those networks that make a difference, that mean something, and that, are not looking back at the past. You don't have to look at the past or be stuck in the past, but you do have to be a placeholder and a knowledge keeper, a knowledge holder, or to be a holder of something of the past in order to have those difficult conversations. Having those difficult conversations then leads to, going over, okay, how do we meet on common ground, within common goals? How are we to balance the scale and to lead with a more intentful life and intent on respecting our treaties? And again, respect. Mutual respect is acknowledging the past, acknowledging the mistakes, and, not just saying, oh, I'm going to, go to blah, 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 reconciliation, but actually putting in the work and putting in the effort. As you've said, an apology, it's just empty words. It's just words from any dictionary or from any textbook. But an apology with action, that is true reconciliation. And, indirectly, we've answered question 5 on how, where, and what reconciliation starts from. And the steps is we need to go back to history. We need to take history with us, not to carry it to make ourselves uglier inside, but for us to carry it so that we can use it as a walking stick when we are leading into the future.
Yeah, that accountability piece, right? And truly to talk about reconciliation in a meaningful way, to me, it does start as that internal process. And it all comes back to natural law. I'm always talking about that reminder of these natural laws of the universe that apply to every human indiscriminately, and so for every person to remember, for as an example, that we are made of land, every single one of us, not just Indigenous people who are aware and conscious of it, but everybody. We are made of the water. We depend on the water to survive. We depend on the plants. We depend on the animals. Even people who don't eat meat depend on the animals because of the plants and the nutrients you depend on, that the animals are part of the life cycle of those beings, right? And so nobody is actually separate or especially superior to land, right?
Yes.
Which is such a colonial ideology that's pushed. Again, it's like when we actually take a moment to look at it and question it, this illusion of, quote unquote, man, speaking of patriarchy, right? Man being superior to nature or having, quote unquote, dominion over nature, there couldn't be something that's more false. We are entirely fully dependent on nature, and coming back to that basic nature, remembering, no matter who a person is, remembering who are you truly, where are your roots from, or what are the many places that your roots are from? How long ago did your ancestors experience colonialism? How long ago did they get on the colonial bandwagon? If you have that Euro settler heritage, acknowledging, that who are you and what are those ancestral dynamics living through your body, right? And because reconciliation starts with that reconciliation of who we are, and with that repair and relationship with our ancestors, and and maybe supporting them in releasing some of the traumas that were stuck for them, which is a lot of the therapeutic work that we do ends up going back some amount of generations. And it's like, oh, okay, there was a stuck trauma for an ancestor. It doesn't matter who culturally or ethnically that ancestor was, right? But just shifting that trauma, and then the reconciliation moves out from there, and they happen at the same time. It's not like we have to do all the internal work and then we're ready to take on reconciliation at a greater capacity. It happens simultaneously. A big part of my process of reconciliation was, diving head first, like I say, into ceremony and culture, and realizing, oh my God, like all this stuff that I've been learning, and all this stuff that I believed was true, was totally false, and being okay to be like, whoa, wow, okay, I was buying into the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, as something that, yeah, that person has schizophrenia, no way, I don't even believe in schizophrenia anymore, and even, we can talk about, that's why I must be so annoying sometimes in conversation, because I have all these qualifiers I have to include, right? Of like, what is labeled as psychosis, and then we can get into that conversation about the spirits, about people's gifts, and kind of question those labels, right? So that process of reconciliation is something that's, it's a holistic process and engagement and happens through relationality. And it is about taking accountability, taking responsibility in ways where there's compassion, right? I always remind people, we don't know what we don't know. So it's not about, oh, you should feel terrible because you diagnosed somebody with something, and now you're learning from Karlee of how that diagnosis can be really harmful. No, it's like you didn't know what you didn't know. Now you know. so now you take that information and say, dang, yeah, like, okay, I was really working in a colonial way. I was really colonizing people.
Yeah.
And now I'm going to undo that, and have compassion in that, have grace in that, have love in that. We live in a brutal society where there is a lot of judgment. There's a lot of criticism there, nowadays. Don't even get me started. I mean, there's a lot of trolls as
Yes.
right? Just people out there who, I understand they're hurt, right? These people are hurt, and they're out there, and they're being destructive, and so it can be hard, and I mean, that all stems back again to those colonial ideologies and colonial methods of using blame and shame and guilt to control people, right? Like,
Yes.
that's where it goes. So, so people learn this stuff, people start engaging in reconciliation, and then it's like, oh, to feel all this shame and guilt, and they feel like just run over by it, kind of thing. And it's like, no, like that's just a form of colonial control. Like, come outside of that, come back to your basic humanity, to spirit, and know that accountability and responsibility can take place without it having to be this horrible thing. It is when we hold ourselves responsible, and when we hold ourselves accountable, that's where we really have the opportunity for healing, right? And our communities always did that historically, right? We had systems and processes of accountability, restorative justice,
Yes.
processes that supported wellness. Accountability is a beautiful thing. Like, we need to not run away from it. We need to move towards it. I know, as someone who was born and raised in the English language, I'll always be decolonizing till the day I die, right?
Yes.
Like, there's always going to be some hidden colonial thing that comes through that's like, oh, yeah, wow, there's another piece that I need to undo, right? But our ceremonies, our ways of life, our elders, our, the Kiti Ayag, they really help us undo that
Yes.
in beautiful ways. So, yeah.
Yeah. And when we're going to reconciliation, that can draw parallels as well as work and exist hand in hand with, debunking and, disassembling racism or sexism, or the, as you've mentioned, and every woman knows this, the patriarchal system, because majority, I don't even know the statistics. I mean, someone would have to look that up separately if they're curious, but I can imagine that the statistics are quite high of how many governments and governing bodies and governing systems are men led. I mean, look at the United States, for example. And there was probably a seldomly occasional circumstance within history and as well as within previous times that they opened the doors and they bridged the way for matriarchal systems and matriarchal leaders and role models, and having those relationships with matriarchal authoritative figures. And this is something, prior to Euro colonization, Euro settler of Canada and the United States and of Turtle Island as a whole, is we were matriarchal led. Our laws, our core values, and what each pole within the teepee represented and why we have 13 teepees. And if someone wants to go into the history of the teepees, feel free to look it up. But you have now, if you're listening and you've heard it during our conversation, you now have a starting point of research, which is teepees and the teepee poles, and going into why there was and the purpose of the 13 teepee poles. In fact, I'll do my own research after this call. But having that sort of governing body where it was the matriarchal leadership and authoritative figures, you can possibly bet your bottom dollar that we were, and it would show from oral teachings and oral conversations, oral storytelling, passed down from word of mouth, is as well as textbooks that are now reiterating and summarizing and making it more apparent to the mainstream media and to the modern media and to the modern audience, is that there's proof, not just word by mouth stories, but also there's scientific, or there's how do I say it, the scientific evidence is that there were truths to be held. There was the social justice. There were the systems built in place to assure that there's social justice. It wasn't one or free for all. It was community based, and it was community led, and it was built on that nuclear, but also more importantly the extended family pitching in and helping out and carrying it. But anyways, going to back and forth reconciliation is there's a lot that can play hand in hand, but there's also a lot that we can learn from these previous 2 episodes. This 2-parter of episode 10 is who we are as people and the information we have. Every single one of us has a story, and we're storytellers in our own right. And it's not something that is meant to be held in.
Yeah.
We, as well as the young people, as we age, we are leading our life a little bit closer to our age, the golden age of being seniors and being the knowledge keepers, and sharing our past knowledge and experiences, and sharing storytellings, and being the PhD holders, and being the universities and colleges, and then passing it on to the younger people.
Yeah. Oh, so I don't have a lot of time left. Are there any other questions that you want to make sure we get to?
Yeah, I have our final question. We'll tie it to what would have been question 6, but we'll make it question 3 for today. One piece of advice that you have for the listeners and viewers.
Yeah, so I mean, for that one, I always come back to, and I might even mention it last time, and I mentioned it today, but really connecting into remembering your power, that you are a perfectly whole, well human being behind whatever is going on up here, and that you have immeasurable power, that you came into this world with incredible gifts that are meant to be shared with community, with the world, and that whatever you've experienced in your life, the things that you've been through, and the diagnoses that you may have been given, or the things you've been told about yourself, none of that has to limit you. And don't take it on. Don't take that stuff on, right? We are powerful beyond measure. We all come in that way. And there is nothing that is beyond healing. So, whatever traumas people have experienced, there are ways to work with that. There are ways to shift, to transform whatever those difficult experiences, whatever that pain, whatever that hurt is, in relation with the land, with the cosmos, and through, different processes of transformation. And you have the power to do that, and follow your spirit to those people, those places, those medicines that will help you in a good way to continue to nurture your power and your gifts. And don't shy away from sharing them with the world.
Yes.
So, I know it can be really scary, especially, we kind of talked about or sort of touched on the judgment out there, the criticism, people who are hurting people out of their own pain. And so it can be hard, people can be really afraid to share their gifts, but just know that's not yours to pick up. That pain, that destructive energy, it's not yours to pick up. Lean into your protections, into your medicines, into your ancestors, and your helpers, and you've got this, and listen to my podcast. Know more about it.
Well, thank you for coming back for part 2 of episode 10. And with that, I'll say good night.
Yeah.
Or we'll say good night.
Molestas. I'll see you again, Stella. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.